Hello and welcome to Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund Challenges of Modern Day Policing series. I'm Jason Johnson, president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. I'm joined by Bill Gleasing, our police use of force expert. Today, Bill, we're going to talk about incidents involving police shooting of unarmed individuals. So you hear a lot about this in media reports and police-involved shootings where the person was quote-unquote not armed. And these are fairly rare when you look at the total number of police-involved shootings. The very few of them, relatively speaking, are of unarmed individuals. But what are some scenarios where these things tend to happen?
Yeah, it gets a lot of media attention, but people have to understand that, first of all, the legal standard that officers are judged on is it has to be looked at and judged from the officer's perspective at the time the force was used, not with the clear vision of 20/20 hindsight. So no officer wants to be involved in a shooting, and no officer is trained to shoot unarmed individuals. But there are several situations where that might occur, to where a person acts based on the totality of an incident, acts as if they do have a weapon. Sometimes there's mental illness involved, where somebody is suicidal and they want the police to do it. So they act as if they have a weapon, and their mannerisms and everything would lead a reasonable police officer or a reasonable person to believe that they are armed. So they're unfortunate situations, but sometimes they do occur. But less than 15% of all officer-involved shootings involve police shooting unarmed individuals. But as I said, it's all based on the suspect's actions and the officer's perception. There's been recent cases, like in Sacramento, California, where a suspect appeared to be armed, and a reasonable person would believe that he was armed based on the totality of the incident. And the officers perceived a cell phone as a weapon, and it turns out that it was a cell phone. But based on the legal standard, it should not be judged on what they found it out to be. It should be judged on what they perceived it at the time they used force.
And in fact, you're talking about the Stephon Clark case from Sacramento.
Correct.
In fact, when the person treats the firearm or treats the object, whether it's a cell phone or something else, they treat it as if it's a firearm, take a shooting stance and point it at the officer or anyone else. I mean, that can really cause officers to react the way they do. We also have scenarios where a person maybe reaches into an area where normally a firearm might be carried, like in the waistband or the pocket, and suddenly reach in and pull something out. In fact, we had some simulator training just today where we saw the officer and the participants' reaction to an object that turns out was not a firearm.
Whoa, Christ, chill out, man. I'm just grabbing my phone.
Are there other types of situations where police officers are encountering and being involved in shootings with people who it turns out, do not have a real firearm?
Yes. Unfortunately, the Tamir Rice incident, which got a lot of national headlines, was a simulated weapon. But when you put it out there, and especially under stress, it's very difficult to see the difference between a simulated firearm, like an airsoft gun or something, and a real weapon. And as I said, the officers, under stress aren't going to have clear vision. Unfortunately, in that particular case, his actions led the police to believe that he was armed, the way he was walking around pointing it at people. And unfortunately, there was not much for the officer to do. They got close to him, and then they unfortunately perceived it as a real weapon and took action. And unfortunately, it turned out it was a toy weapon. But at that time, they believed it to be a real weapon based on the totality of the incident, his actions leading up to that.
Is there any way for a police officer responding to the scene of any kind of incident to tell the difference between, say an airsoft pistol or any other type of simulated weapon and a real firearm?
Some of the simulated weapons have like an orange tip painted on, but criminals have been known to paint orange tips on real guns. There's all sorts of guns out there now that, they don't look like real weapons, and they are. So it's very difficult for an officer, especially under stress, to focus in on that and determine whether it's a real weapon or a replica weapon. And unfortunately, with action versus reaction, if you're going to sit there and assess it and it is a real weapon, you're going to be behind the curve on reaction time, and you're going to increase your vulnerability.
Yeah. Are there situations also where an unarmed individual engages in a struggle with the police officer? I mean, every time a police officer is introduced to any situation, that we know at least one firearm is involved.
Yeah, and it said sometimes there is a struggle over an officer's weapon. So if the officer's able to retain it and the person tried to get the weapon, then sometimes the media will portray that he was unarmed. The person, he or she was unarmed. But in reality, they tried to arm themselves with the officer's weapon. In Ferguson, same thing. The DNA supports that that individual grabbed the officer's weapon and tried to disarm the officer. And at that point, you don't know what they're going to do with that weapon. Are they going to use it against the officer? Are they going to use it against others? So the officers have to obviously maintain that weapon. How long are you going to fight over that weapon? How long are you going to let them keep coming back at you to try to disarm you?
So fear of being disarmed. If a police officer is getting ready to be disarmed, naturally their fear will be, well, when they are disarmed, they're an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury by their own firearm.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you for joining us in this episode of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund Challenges of Modern Day Policing series.